Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Recently, the Convocations Committee at North Idaho College came up with a program, a 5-day program entitled Resources, Increasing Demand, Decreasing Supply. That committee was generous enough to allow us to interview those speakers they had on campus, and today and over the next 2 or 3 months, over a period of time, we're going to bring some of those programs to you, not in a consecutive way, but every 2 or 3 weeks there will be one of those programs. In order to start that series, I'm very happy to welcome to the program today Professor Albert Allen Bartlett, who is a professor of physics at the University of Colorado. Dr. Bartlett has a most impressive background. He has numerous publications, and he's received a number of awards and honors. He has also served as the national president of the American Association of Physics Teachers in the year 1978. Dr. Bartlett holds a baccalaureate degree from Colgate University and degrees in the field of physics, a master's and a PhD from Harvard University. As I've indicated, he does teach at the University of Colorado, where he's been since 1950. Also, during several summers, he has taught at Harvard University on the faculty in the field of physics. He's going to be with us today to discuss particularly his topic of the forgotten fundamentals of the energy crisis. Dr. Bartlett, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Tony.
I'm happy to welcome to the panel to question our guests. First of all is Dr. Cargill, Owen Cargill, who is the Associate Dean of Instruction at North Idaho College and Director of Planning, and Mary Lou Reed, who's a regular member of the panel. We'll commence the question with Dr. Cargill.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Dr. Bartlett, in what ways will our lives be changed in the year 2000 because of limited resources?
I think we will find ourselves paying a much larger fraction of our family budgets for energy. Certainly our institutional budgets, the fraction of those that go for energy will go up. I think the price of energy will go up very definitely. We'll also find ourselves with higher taxes simply to pay the costs of the increased population that we find in all parts of our country. And so I think we'll find ourselves with probably with less disposable income, larger fraction of our income going to the necessities of energy and to taxes, which obviously are a necessity in our communities if the growth is to continue.
Lou Reed.
Dr. Bartlett, I hope I quote you correctly. I believe you said to the students that you feel the greatest shortcoming is our inability to understand simple arithmetic. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Would you expound on that, please? Expound.
The arithmetic is the simple arithmetic of growth. And it's the same arithmetic you have if you have compound interest on money in the bank. If you have something growing 5% per year, then you'd write this very simple arithmetic to show how large a growing quantity was, whether it's your money in the savings bank or whether it's a population of your community. And this arithmetic is simply not understood by most people. And you say 5% per year in terms of population. Most people have no idea what that really means in terms what happens in 5 years or 50 years if you had 5% growth.
What does it mean?
All right, let's take 70 years, because 70 years is about a lifetime, and it's very easy to calculate. If you have 5% growth for 70 years, then the increase is found by multiplying 5 2's together. So you get 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. 5% for 70 years gives an increase by a factor of 32. Put $1 in a bank at 5% annual interest for 70 years, and you get $32. Have a population of 1,000 people growing 5% per year for 70 years, you get 32,000 people. If you have a school system that's growing 5% per year for 70 years, where you have one school today, you're going to have 32 schools later on. It's this kind of arithmetic. People think 5% is very easy. We can live with that. But then they don't realize what the numbers mean.
But this is the rule of 70, is it not? And I think it's important to simplify it to say that the rule of 70 means the doubling factor.
All right. The rule of 70, which is sort of the following. If you have 5% growth, then the question is, how long does it take for the growing quantity to double in size? And the rule of 70 says, take 70, divide it by the 5% per year, and you get 14 years. So this says anything growing 5% per year will double in 14 years, double in size. If you had something growing 10% per year, it's going to double in 7 years. Something growing 14% per year is going to double in 5 years.
Okay, but put it in terms, very specific terms, not just something doubling, say people.
People, yeah, sure. If you have 14% growth in a population, steadily for 5 years the population will double. If you have 14% interest on your bank account, for 5 years, your bank account size will double. And it's very interesting that the financiers who understand this arithmetic when it's applied to bank accounts do not understand it when it's applied to populations. They think about it as though it's a different world.
Dr. Bartlett, in your address to the student body, I was extremely impressed with some of the statistics that you use that you're indicating now to the audience concerning some of our energy issues, petroleum and coal in particular. Prior to hearing your address, I think I am, like most people, somewhat naive about reports that I read concerning the years that we are going to have ahead of us for the use of petroleum and coal. And I wish you'd take a moment to tell our audience that when we see that we have half of the supply left yet, does that mean that some of those projections are correct, that some of them, as you indicated, they report that we had coal for 500 years and so forth. Please show us the fallacies in that type of reporting.
Well, the thing that's most often said about coal is that it will last for 500 years. Occasionally, in one of the major news magazines, they said at present rates of consumption, it will last for 500 years. Now, that is correct to say at present rates of consumption, meaning if there's zero growth of coal production. But nobody, exactly nobody, is suggesting that we have zero growth of coal production. And so what you have to say is, well, how long would it last with some of the growth rates that people are talking about? We had President Gerald Ford talking about a growth of around 10% per year. He set goals to say coal production in 1985 should be up to about 2.1 billion tons from about 0.6 billion tons. That calls for 11% per year. And now if you could continue 11% per year until the coal was gone, then coal in this country would last the order of 50 years, which is within the life expectancy of students now in school.
I believe in the case of petroleum that is even a lesser period of time that we could be facing no petroleum at all. Would you go through that, even though we're finding new sources of petroleum? And I believe you've indicated that when you first look at the statistics, it looks like we have a rather large reservoir that we do not realize that the mathematical tabulations that you're using.
Well, the petroleum, we've used roughly half of the recoverable petroleum that was ever in the ground in the United States. Now, for some people, they will often phrase this and say, well, that means we've got as much petroleum left as all we've ever used, and it's been over 100 years since we discovered it. It must be another 100 years worth. Well, it's 100 years worth. If it was growing for the first 100 years and we've used half of it, then it's going to decline for the next 100 years. And so we're past the peak of petroleum production in this country, and petroleum production peaked in 1970, and it's been going steadily downhill ever since, and it will continue to go downhill throughout all the predictable future. If you do have discoveries, these will be little bumps on the downhill sides of the curve. And Alaska is a significant little fractional bump on the side of the curve. But, you know, I have seen the statement in, I think it was in Business Week, that one of the major oil companies that has invested in the North Slope oil in Alaska, that they are diversifying their corporate structure simply because they know that the peak of Alaskan production will be before the end of this decade of the 1980s.
Let's suppose we have a 7% growth rate, which we often hear discussed. How long would petroleum last if that was to take place?
At 10% growth rate or something, annual growth rate of petroleum. At 7%, the world petroleum would be out in about 20 years, at 7%. But now the interesting thing is I have to use those arguments about continued steady growth because everyone in our communities, our business leaders, our industrial leaders, our community leaders, everyone at the community level, local level, state level, everyone wants to see growth. And so we have to ask, well, what would happen if they had their way? And the answer is you'd be out very quickly. Now, the real fact is that these things can't continue to grow simply because the enormous capital investment it takes. You can't have coal production continuing to grow very rapidly simply because it costs so many $1 million to open a new coal mine. There aren't the resources. A large fraction of our fiscal resources in this country now are devoted to getting new energy sources. And with that kind of a situation, then all the rest of the economy suffers because so much has to go into developing new energy sources. Think of the cost of the Alaska pipeline and so on, these enormous energy efforts. So what we find is it can't go on, even though people want to keep promoting it as though it could go on.
Dr. Cargill.
Dr. Bartlett, what you seem to be suggesting is that energy is decreasing, the energy resources are decreasing at an increasing rate. So my question is, what are the implications on contemporary society if we're looking at the year 2000 as a year wherein we have perhaps fewer resources available per capita than we do now?
We'll learn to get along with less resource per capita. This is a necessity that's made, it's clear from the arithmetic that we will have to do this. The energy per capita that we will be using will be less than it is now, for two reasons: the declining resources, and the second reason is the enormous rate of increase of the population of the United States. The population of the United States is growing at the fastest rate of any industrialized nation in the world. In many categories, the United States could be classified an underdeveloped nation. And now let's just look at the primary categories. The main exports of underdeveloped nations are raw materials, and in some cases food. All right, how does the United States fit? Raw materials, we export coal. I think this is a criminal act, practically, to deprive our grandchildren and our children of the coal they're going to need for low-cost energy. We're shipping it overseas as fast as we can. Get rid of it as fast as we can. That's the official policy in Washington, and they're shipping it over with the heavy industry. Food is our principal export. So on that category, we fit as an underdeveloped nation. Then underdeveloped nations are characterized by their principal imports are manufactured goods. That's certainly our situation. And the third big characteristic of an underdeveloped nation is rapid growth of population. Our growth is the fastest of any of the developed nations. All of the Western European industrial nations are practically at zero population growth. And here we are growing the order of 2.1 million people per year increase in this country. A good share of that is immigration, a big fraction of that is illegal immigration, but nonetheless we have a big population growth. What do you do with 2 million net increase in the people per year in this country? Think what an effort it is in Congress to have a jobs bill that will provide, say, 500,000 jobs a year, and then figure our population is increasing 2 million a year. These things are going to make an enormous difference, and we are seeing then a clash of our rising expectations and our declining resources to support those expectations.
Concurrent with the decline in resources, we should expect perhaps a change in the attitude toward growth, a change in the positive attitude toward growth in population, growth in industry, growth in business.
Yes, I think so. And, you know, it sort of galls me every time I hear a newspaper report, see it in a newspaper report, or see it on television when the national commentators say, oh, we just had a good, healthy 3% growth, or a good, healthy 8% growth in this or that. Well, you know, you never say, I have a good, healthy cancer. You never hear that. Now, how come, why do we have such a different standard? Why can't we say, gee, we're going to have to live, this society on this earth that survives in the long term is going to be the society that's in equilibrium with nature. And growth is not an equilibrium condition. Growth is an abnormal, steady, and abnormal, short-term, transient phenomenon. We're going to have to get out of this if we're going to survive.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest today is Professor Albert Bartlett, who is in the field of physics, and he teaches at the University of Colorado. We shall continue the questioning with Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Bartlett, would you answer your own question? Why is it that our society in the United States did not seem to be understanding the limits of growth? What needs to be done? What kind of policies could we adopt that would, policies or attitudes could we adopt that would change things around?
Well, I think education, and that's what we're all here for, is the principal thing that we have to do. We have to educate people so they understand arithmetic. Very simple arithmetic of compound interest, of steady growth, so that they can see what the implications are, and in seeing those implications then can make better decisions about all manners of public policy that affect growth.
Well, are there particular policies that you would like to see changed? You mentioned immigration.
Immigration is a critical one. At this moment, the immigration bill has been killed in Congress in spite of the fact that it is reported by all the surveys that the population of the United States overwhelmingly supports improvement in the control of illegal immigration into the United States. That's a critical one. I think it's time, for instance, that one looked at the deduction on personal income tax for children members of the family. And instead of just giving a flat deduction for as many children as you have, that at some point you say, well, you give your deductions for the first ones, but then 0 for the ones after that, and then maybe at some point charge you extra taxes for the children. Now, again, I think this is a very difficult area. One doesn't have powers of coercion such as the government of China has in terms of controlling the Chinese population, but they have recognized in China, and they're bringing the full power of the People's Republic government to bear on the problem of stopping their population growth. And their official statement is that they recognize now that population growth inhibits economic growth. And if they're going to have economic growth, if they're going to have a better life for their people, then they have to stop the population growth. And we don't recognize that yet, and we have to recognize it.
And the Chinese also offer quite a number of incentives, right?
Incentives, and it's a very different society from ours. But what we have to do is find things within our society that will do. Well, maybe the government, I know of no indication from Washington that there is recognition there of population growth as being a problem. You sort of look for your leaders in Washington to say statements, make statements to say, this is a problem, we need to address it. I don't know of anyone in Washington who's ever said this.
The United States has no limits. This is part of our myth,
That's
right?
part of the marvelous myth.
Right.
We do have limits, and I think that we have to recognize them and start planning for these. And you can see the alternative. Everyone watching has experienced the alternative of gas lines at the station when some agent or circumstance outside our political control has cut off one of our critical resources. Then, gee, we're in a panic. Now's the time to plan. Now's the time when the federal government ought to be investing large sums in the development of synthetic fuels. We do have very sizable resources in terms of oil shale, in terms of low-grade coal and so on that can be converted. These cannot be developed overnight. You need to have the effort spanning several years, maybe a decade or more, in order to get the chemical engineering from the small batch level up to large-scale production. You can't do it overnight. Now's the time, when there's no pressure on, now's the time we should be doing that. But nobody's doing it. They've canceled all that stuff, saying the energy crisis is over.
Dr. Bartlett, something else that you've dealt with today concerns the relationship between depleting resources and inflation. I wish you would give the viewing audience of television some of the same statistics you gave to the students, indicating that if we continue the growth that you have discussed and the resources continue to deplete at that rate, what would it be like to purchase various items within 20, 30 years that people are so used to and feel that are so essential? What can we look forward to in the area of cost of cars and homes and other such items?
The example I used came from a class. And I asked the students just to take 7% annual inflation. And 7% is something that we've seen. We've seen higher inflations. Ask them to say, well, what would this be like in 60 years? And 60 years, a reasonable life expectancy for students now in college. And what you get was, for a 55-cent gallon of gas, that was the price when we did it. You can remember 55 cents a gallon. Well, 55 cents a gallon, it would go up to $35.20. $2.50 for a movie is something several $100s. $15 sack of groceries that my mother used to buy for $1.25. That's $960. And a $4,000 car will cost $250,000. Now that's a 7% inflation. And you know, it was interesting. Another example I used was a headline from our local paper in Boulder, where it said that the consumer price index has doubled in 11 years. And, you know, that's an alarmist headline. And I just pointed out to people, that's only 6.3% growth per year. You go back to our formula of 70, our rule of 70. If you divide 70 by that 11-year doubling time, you get 6.3% growth per year. It's just these examples, it seems so innocuous. And young people especially don't have a history of remembering when gasoline was 55 cents a gallon, or 30 cents a gallon, or 20 cents a gallon. But most of the rest of us can remember those things, and so we can see this in progress already. All of those prices on the left-hand column of that graph have roughly doubled in 5 or 6 years since I put that together.
Dr. Cargill.
Dr. Bartlett, I believe earlier you suggested that world food production would have to double by the year 2015. What are some of the scenarios for people in the United States and in the rest of the world if we cannot, in fact, double world food production on the same amount of arable land?
Now, that quotation was from Science magazine. It was given as a news item, a report of an international commission that had studied the food problem. And they said we have something the order of 30 years that we have to double food production. Well, now doubling in 30 years means something less than 2% growth per year. That just about matches the present growth rate of the world population. The world population is growing 1.8, 1.9% per year. So this means just to feed people, continue to feed people at the present level of nutrition would require doubling of food production in the next 30 years. And the thing that notice went on, that report went on to say was that we'll have to do it with essentially no increase in the agricultural land available. And they didn't elaborate on that, but I took this to mean that, that their view was that we now have under cultivation about all the land on this earth that we can in fact cultivate, that you're not going to see a doubling of the land production, land that's under cultivation. So just in those terms, and then you realize that those increases then, if they can't come from doubling the land that's available, they have to come from improved strains of grains and wheats and so on, from more use of fertilizer, more use of insecticide, more mechanical cultivation. And all of those are based on petroleum, and we're on the downhill side of the petroleum curve. And so you can see the clash, increasing demands of petroleum for agriculture, decreasing availability of petroleum to do the jobs that people have to do in agriculture.
Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Bartlett, your arithmetic your numbers are very, very depressing, but do you have some reasons for optimism for the world down the road, both in terms of population and energy? Do you see some signs that are a little bit more hopeful?
Well, certainly
in relation to growth.
Certainly the fact that we can discuss this before television cameras, that's very hopeful. If we can educate people, and that's the way to do in the United States, we try to educate people to the problem so that people with better education can make better decisions. One very good reason for optimism is that if you go back 15 years and look at the big projections that were made by giant, well-funded studies, millions of dollars to study the question, what would be the U.S. energy consumption annually by the year 2000, which is 17 years from now? And all of those curves all pointed up like that. They just went up at a steady growth rate. They all said it's going to go. And it's interesting, you look after the year 2000, and all they put was a question mark. Well, now they wrote big volumes to say the country would come apart if you ever fell below that growth curve. Well, now, with all the Arab disruption of the oil supplies, we have fallen below the growth rate. Now, it's been painful. There have been very painful dislocations. But we now have had, for a year or two, zero growth of our national energy consumption. That's good news. We've proven that the experts were wrong. We've proven we can get along without being on that steady growth curve of energy consumption. And now what we have to do is to stay with a zero growth mode for energy consumption of our nation as a whole. Now that's going to be difficult if the population is growing 1% per year and your energy usage is held constant. That means every one of us has to get along each year with 1% less energy than we had the year before. There's a lot of room there for conservation. Now the second reason for optimism is simply this. If people understand the problem, understand the arithmetic, then we can see what we have to do. Many people faced with enormous complexities of the energy crisis and all kinds of conflicting statements in the public press from all manner of experts just sort of throw up their hands and say, you know, there's nothing we can do. Well, there are things we can do. If we understand that the problem is growth, then we can start in our local community and say, look, it doesn't make sense to charge us all more taxes so that we can have population growth. It doesn't make more sense to try to have population growth in our states. It doesn't make sense to try to say, well, we've got to keep building electric generating plants to handle all these people that aren't here yet. Charge all our people enormous rates for electric plants that we have to build. Do you know what it costs for an electric plant? Per person. It costs $1,000 for the utility. This means if you have 1% growth in the service area of an electric utility, then every year that you have 1% growth, every person in there has to pay 1% of $1,000. $10 for every individual to pay for electric plants for people that aren't here yet. And so if we can get a recognition of some of these things and start at the local level, we can't start at Congress. Congress responds to us. If we want growth, then Congress will go along with it. But if we want to stop the growth in terms of saying we can't afford it, we don't have the resources, we want to have a better life without having the growth, then Congress will follow us. And that's what we have to do, I think.
Are you also optimistic about some of the alternative fuels? You mentioned synthetic, and that surprised me that you really were hopeful about synthetic fuels. Some of the other alternative fuels, solar, et cetera, do you feel that these can be adequate substitutes for fossil fuels combined with conservation?
Solar energy will certainly make a big impression on home heating bills because it's very well suited and matched for that, but it's not going to make any impression on our industrial consumption of energy. And one can see the limitation because, for instance, on about this tabletop here, in bright sun at high noon, you would have the order of 1 kilowatt. And the best you can do with present solar cells is to convert that at about 15% efficiency. So an area like this, you get 150 watts. Well, now that's about 1/8 of what an electric toaster requires. And so the solar energy thing can help in home heating. But in terms of generating electricity, in terms of making a big impression in our industrial consumption of energy, I don't look for it to be very big. Nuclear fusion, my own prediction is that children born today, 1983, will not live to see 5% of our national energy supplied by nuclear fusion. Now, you read optimistic things about fusion, but these come from people who either don't understand it or people who are in the business and have to be optimistic. You wouldn't fund their research if they weren't optimistic. Well, we want to go on with the research on nuclear fusion, but I'll guarantee you that if they can ever make it work to generate electric power, it'll be so complicated that it's not clear that they can get the reliable power that's there 24 hours a day, day and night, the very reliable power we're used to.
We're almost out of time, but one question that I think we have time for is that we have a lot of national campaigns over the years in which candidates have been very successful by having as part of their platform that they want a 5, 6, or 7% growth rate. That's been a major issue. Do you foresee that not being a path to take in the future for candidates?
Well, I hope we will begin to see candidates who will talk steady state instead of growth. I think that's very important. That will be the mark of a far-sighted politician who can say we've got to learn to live with what we have. We don't want to increase our dependence on foreign suppliers of energy or other resources. But I'm afraid that the idea of growth is good is so deeply ingrained in our whole society that this will be slow happening.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we're out of time. And Professor Bartlett, on behalf of our staff, I express our appreciation for your appearance, and I must add that it has been most informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
And
appreciate
thanks
it very much.
To the panel also. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Albert Allen Bartlett, who is a professor of physics at the University of Colorado, and he's been discussing with you what we believe to be a very important topic concerning the resources of this country and the forgotten fundamentals of the energy crisis that we've had in the past. I want to remind you that in the weeks to come, with some other programs inserted in between, we shall continue to talk about resources, increasing demand, and decreasing supply until we have concluded 5 such programs. And again, I want to thank the Convocations Committee for providing these guests for our opportunity to question them for you. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to bring you another program of our series entitled Resources, Increasing Demand, Decreasing Supply. It is my responsibility and also my privilege to recognize the fact that the North Idaho College Convocations Committee has brought these people to our campus and have shared those individuals with us for this program. Concerning resources, our guest today, Mr. Ed Stern, will discuss wind power development from the local and national perspective, which is one of the subtopics of that series. Mr. Stern is the Director of Community Development for the City of Livingston, Montana. He holds a BA degree from the University of California at Berkeley in the field of special education with an emphasis in earth sciences. He has also done work in archaeology for energy sources. Mr. Stern, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to welcome to the panel today to question our guests. First of all, regular panelist Mary Lou Reed, who is always a delight to have on the program and has very outstanding questions. Second, we have Mr. Kurt Nelson, who is in the field of computer science and mathematics at North Idaho College and has been here before, and we're happy to welcome him back. And our third panel member is a regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who, as I indicated recently, graduated from law school and has returned to our program. We will commence the questioning with Mary Lou Reed.
Ed, will you tell us what kind of wind power installation you have in place in Livingston, Montana?
What we've developed there is a municipal wind power facility owned by the local government. It's comprised of 5 modern wind turbines, that is electrical generators. It constitutes, amazingly enough, the first wind power publicly owned project in the United States. Probably doesn't reflect as well on us as it reflects on the fact that there's a dearth of other groups involving themselves in this form of public power.
And is there a lot of wind in Livingston, Montana?
It's the 7th windiest reporting station in this country. There's no lack of it.
Explain how this came about. This really is unique for a community to have a wind power installation.
Yeah,
What's the history?
Well, certainly public power is no stranger to the American scene. It's been around even before utilities were developed in this country, since the time of Edison. But we got involved in energy, oddly enough, not from the standpoint of developing electrical resources, as much as the recognition that we needed to develop job opportunities in the face of a tremendous loss of jobs in our base employment, that is the Burlington Northern Railroad. And we recognized that we were going to have to compete for jobs in a world market, in a national market. And we didn't want to get involved in smokestack chasing, that is, trying to attract one group here that could as well locate in San Diego or Cincinnati. We attempted to identify the resources we had in hand, quantify those, and then bring those to market. In this case, that happened to be wind energy, oddly enough.
How many jobs?
We're projecting quite a few. So far, we've started off, we've had one group move from Chicago. We've had a number of operation and maintenance jobs associated with facilities that are just run for generating electricity. We would hope, though, before the end of this decade to be looking more in the area of hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs.
Kurt Nelson.
It's very interesting, Ed. These 5 generators that your city now pretty much maintains and owns, what's the deal? I mean, you buy these and then you feed power back to utilities company. Is that how it works? And then how long would it take to pay one of those machines off? Or do you actually end up making quite a bit of money, or is it long-term or short-term?
Well, the project we're involved in, it's a commercialization project. That is, it was constructed for commercial purposes, the sale of electricity. But in effect, given that the wind energy industry is about the same level where the automobile industry was in 1904, it could be more properly conceived of as a demonstration project. That is, how well will it work? How long will it work? What are the bugs you run into, the glitches? What's the pro side of wind energy? We're not only involved, Kurt, in the ownership of those machines, those 5 that you mentioned outright, but we're also joint venturing with the private sector. That is, allowing use of publicly owned lands where we then receive a share of the energy generated, similar to an oil royalty. We're doing this with some American groups as well as some European groups. That's basically how we see our role at this time. We feel that as wind energy proves itself, which it surely will, that the jobs will be a natural counterpart to that success, in the sense that as more machines are up and constructed, whether they run well at first or require quite a bit of debugging, as the word is, the operation and maintenance jobs, assembly, and then manufacturing jobs are sure to follow.
Janelle Burke.
Why wind? how did you settle on the wind, other than that the wind is there, but you use this? What studies had been done before you began to harness the wind?
Right.
All right. Did you just start from the old windmill system, in other words?
No, we jumped into it from a very modern standpoint, that is the wind turbines, modern generation. We got into it because, first of all, Livingston's a very windy place. Anybody from Montana is aware of that. We've been the butt of many jokes over the years. The time that the gentleman was digging post holes for a fence he was putting in at his ranch in the evening, and the wind was blowing so hard, had a friend holding a flashlight. He had to have him 10 yards upwind so that the light would bend and reach him at the post hole he was digging. Oddly enough, these jokes turned around and became something productive because of the energy crisis. And I'm sure that's a tune that's been sounded before. But in this case, the viability of wind energy, probably the most attainable technology in the renewable energy field in an immediate sense. That is that the hardware is coming online. It has the ability to generate the most electricity in the shortest amount of time, more so than photovoltaics or the other fields. It was just a natural.
Well, what about places that aren't so windy? We know Livingston is windy, but what about other places that may not have quite as much natural wind? Is wind still a choice, an alternative?
Wind is a choice in anything that offers a reasonable average wind speed. As the cost of electricity increases, the amount of wind necessary to make wind energy economic will decrease also. It's a dynamic effect.
What presently is that, approximately?
Well, it's not a simplistic approach in that wind in itself spells viability. That is, the stronger the wind, the more viable your area. It's a combination of buyback rates from the utilities, what kind of facilities, thermal or hydro, that they're operating currently to provide the base load. But as a rule of thumb, I would say 10 to 12 right now would be the minimum in terms of miles per hour of wind speed for viability.
Lou Reed.
Well, what are some of the cons of wind power? I mean, are there problems with noise, and are these things attractive? That they aren't the pretty little windmills that we think of in terms of Greece and Holland?
Well, in fact, Holland and the Netherlands, the Baltic states, are very active in wind energy, not any more tulips and wooden windmills, but in fact the modern electric turbines. Some of the cons, though, to answer your question, Mary Lou, the technology is not fully developed yet. Whereas we can put people on the moon, that is in America, it's still proven to be a very difficult chore to develop a piece of hardware, dynamic as a wind machine is, that will stand up to the rigors of the wind, the variations in the wind. The wind is very fickle in the sense that it changes direction, changes wind speed, and in very small intervals, such that it puts tremendous load on the machinery. In many respects, the American industry, those in America providing the hardware, making the hardware, are lagging behind their European and possibly their Japanese counterparts.
In the technology?
In the technology.
Is that not unusual? We like to think of ourselves as being ahead in R&D.
Right. It's a combination of factors that are leading to that development. Primarily is the tax credit situation in California, where wind energy has become more lucrative as a tax shelter than as an energy generator, that is, to provide electricity. And what we see there is a real rush, a need, a demand for machinery in order that those machines will be installed and online and meet the tax requirements before the expiration of the tax credit. In most cases, the purchasers have turned to American manufacturers. Most American manufacturers are small groups, that is, small manufacturers with cash flow problems, as most small groups are. And it's been very difficult for them to, so to speak, not to take advantage of somebody with money on their counter saying, give me 100 units of your machine. And in most cases, unfortunately, most of the American manufacturers are providing hardware in large volume into that California market to meet the tax credit demand, hardware that is unfortunately not fully developed.
Well, what about noise? Is that a con? I've heard this from people, that these can be very, very, very noisy machines.
The noise problem can be controlled. That's more a function of the kind of material you use and the configuration of the material. Those kinds of factors can all be adjusted for, whether it be radio interference, noise, even visual problems, that is, that they're not considered aesthetic or ugly, in fact. Those can be pretty much minimized. Those can be pretty much minimized by different design configurations. The real nut of the problem is the technology up to date enough to warrant many units out in the field, such as is the American industry ready to provide at this time large volumes of machinery? There's questions as to that. The other side of the coin is that the Europeans have been involved in wind energy longer. I'm just not talking the picturesque windmills. I'm talking about since World War II. The energy crisis has been more of an ongoing situation in Europe than it was in this country. The Americans got into it because of the energy crisis, and so they're very late in developing this hardware, and they're not as far along in the learning curve. And yet they're putting many, many units in the field, especially in California.
Can I ask you to clarify one more point? You lost me on the joint venture. You said that there were some national and international joint venture. Could you give an example of what you're doing there?
Well, certainly the prospect for municipalities, whether it be well, local government, county, city, state, joint action agencies, that is the melding of various local governments. Very strong. There's a long history of public power in this country, and wind will certainly prove to be one of those sources for public power. The direction to get into it, that is direct ownership of machinery, the facility, is the more traditional approach. And yet it's a very costly venture, especially in these early years when the technology is not fully debugged. In many cases, as viable an approach is for local governments to joint venture with the private sector in this machinery, in the sense that they provide the land base, such as a rancher might allow oil activity on his land, yet not have any direct involvement, and enjoy simply an income stream defined by the contract, the lease contract. That is as viable approach at this early stage for local government participation in this energy development as direct ownership.
And you're at the exploratory stage of that, of applying that concept?
That's correct. We've both bought hardware that we own and maintain, as well as joint venturing through land lease arrangements with private sector groups.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest is Mr. Ed Stern, who is one of the guests of this series we're doing on resources, increasing demand, and decreasing supply. He is the Director of Community Development for the city of Livingston, Montana, and today we're addressing wind power development both at the local and the national level. We shall continue the questioning with Kurt Nelson.
Now, Mr. Stern, you mentioned joint venturing. Is Livingston as a town trying to possibly promote new technology or development of wind systems? Have they considered trying to maybe set up research farms as well, such as the designs like the Darius windmill, the rotating cylinder, exotic sails in the sunset kind of ideas that people might have? That would probably promote a lot of new technology and employment. Have you been given any thought towards that, just setting up research generators along in parallel with your wind turbines that are online now?
We've not only given thought to that, we've developed experimental wind test sites for private companies. And there's an application currently pending before the state government in Montana for a research station. We met with the Undersecretary of Energy, Pat Collins, the newly appointed Undersecretary, in regards to some perhaps federal participation, basically because there's a need for standardization of hardware, and the U.S. is not providing that standardization. It's almost as if there were no UL approval for wind machines, and they're being foisted on the public without a clear understanding of what's kosher and what is not. We've proposed Livingston could, in addition to a number of other sites, provide that. Livingston perhaps being a northern climate, mid-latitude, high altitude site. I think a coastal site would also be an appropriate site because of the denser air, the more corrosive, salt-laden atmosphere.
You're working through the universities also on that in Montana?
We've attempted to work with the universities. There's a land-grant college in Bozeman. So far, it appears that their conception of broadening their participation in new technology is silicone chip-oriented. Sometimes the nose in front of your face is one of the last objects you see in your life, and unfortunately this might apply to some of the universities we're dealing with.
Janelle Burke.
What has been the role of the public utilities in the development of wind power?
By public utilities, you mean what then?
Such as Washington Water Power, Idaho Power Company, the companies that supply our power to us, the power supply companies.
In the late 70s, early 80s, it was very much in vogue for utilities to appear to be heavily involved and interested in renewable energy development. In fact, a number of utilities that I'm aware of experimented with lead projects involving wind turbines, photovoltaic, but on a very small basis. Unfortunately, most of the experiences I've seen, those projects ended up on magazine covers supplied by the utilities and then tended to be dismantled. It's almost as if it was important to develop a project, develop the publicity associated with the project, and then as much an investment to prove that the project didn't work after achieving the publicity with it. It's just a truism in this country, not only of utilities, but large corporations of all kinds, that the more resources, the more money, the larger you are, the less risk you take. It's almost an inverse relationship of the way you would, common sense, think it should be. Utilities almost appear to have a vested interest in proving these systems don't work because they have a vested interest in maintaining their investments in the conventional generating plants. And it's important to understand that these renewable energies are very much a threat to the way utilities have been doing business in this country. That is, centralized services from a monopolistic corporate group. Renewable energies, by definition, are decentralized and diversified.
To your knowledge, is there a public utility that does sell energy from a wind source in the United States?
The two largest utilities in this country, Pacific Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison, both operating out of California, are negotiating contracts whereby they will purchase electricity from independent power producers. They are not so much developing these technologies for themselves as contracting to purchase any power that might be generated from them. I think those would be the two lead utilities in this country.
Mr. Stern, I'm sure there are others in the audience other than myself that have a very curious mind about how the wind generating process works. We do not have the opportunity to show slides and so forth on this program, but would you take a few moments to try to give a visual picture yourself? You've been talking with Lou about the fact that they're not the traditional windmills that we've known about. What does a generator look like, and how does it particularly function to pick up the air and to use it and to generate the power that's used by whoever the consumer might be?
I think the best way to conceive of it in an abstract sort of way would be to visualize a modern airplane engine operating on blades. The engine and the blade sitting at the top of a pole anywhere from 80 to 160 feet in the air, spinning at various speeds. I think that is what a modern turbine is. One end or extreme of that picture would be the large wind electric conversion systems developed by groups like Boeing, United Technologies Corporation of Connecticut. These would be best conceived of as the Seattle Space Needle with a modular home at the top with two blades the length of a football field spinning in a breeze. These machines are in existence today. These are utility-sized machines that will be proliferated later in this decade into the next century. They will provide decentralized utility-scale electrical generation. The other extreme would be the smaller machines such as appeared in the 1920s and 30s to power the radios and the refrigerators in rural sites, the Jacobs machines, the Aerolites, the Dunlights that we're all perhaps familiar with. Those are primarily for rural applications where people just want to be left alone, not hooked up to the grid, and thank you very much.
What do you do with the criticism of the fact that from what I understand, that you have this extension that's so high into the air and so forth, and it has to do with aesthetic problems and so forth, if cities wish to maintain a different kind of environment? In other words, a lot of electrical wires have gone underground. How do you deal with this problem?
Well, you're dealing there with a subjective question. Is a wind turbine handsome or is it ugly, or a shade in between? I would counter that with the question, how do you find a coal-fired thermal plant? Is it an attractive item? Do you enjoy the stacks, the smoke that's originated from them, or perhaps even nuclear? Is the waste an attractive item? Do we enjoy playing with that and deciding where it should go? In that respect, given the options on the American, in the world market for electrical generation, I find a wind turbine to be very handsome, aesthetically as well as conceptually.
Lou Reed.
Well, Ed, you said you got into this through the jobs aspect. Could I ask you what kind of careers, in the way of career possibilities, do you see in the field of alternative energy? Do you see this as opening up wide, or are there so many national policies, and you talked about the utilities as being problematic? If you were young today, well, you are young, but what would you be recommending to young people in this, in the way of careers?
If I were recommending to young people careers, I would recommend mattress testing myself. I find sleeping to be most enjoyable, but actually in the field
they have to work.
Yes, given that sore subject, wind energy, photovoltaic, the decentralized electrical generating sources are going to be a feature and a major feature of the future, potentially as important as the thermal plants and hydro plants that we all recognize today as being staples in our electric needs. We're operating in Montana, and perhaps I can best answer it through this picture. It's important to understand that Montana, rather than being conceived of as a state, could more properly economically be pictured as one of the last territories of the United States. It's an area where the raw resources are its major item, generally exploited and developed by out-of-state interests, those products being shipped out of state for development, use, and distribution. Therefore, Montana has a history, as do most of the other western states, a long history of boom and bust cycles associated with the need for that raw product. We're also, as Idaho is, far from the marketplace, that is the large population centers of this country. What do? Do you allow yourself then as a state, as a community, to ride the tides of interest in those products, the marketplace for those products? I would suggest, and I would put forth this proposition, that the biggest and best commodity this country is going to need in terms of a product in the years ahead is electrical. It's actually electricity. And in that sense, Montana and the other energy-rich states, not only from a conventional sense, but obviously in this case wind energy, has a product that will probably be premier on the marketplace in America and beyond. In this case, then, we're no longer isolated from the marketplace because the wind cannot be removed. If you're going to develop it, you need to develop it on site. Something interesting happens then. It's a scale of economy because you need wind turbines to harness the wind. You need many turbines to harness much wind. As you develop and put in place more hardware on the ground, you need more teams to service it. As you have more machinery, a concentration of machinery associated with the harnessing of the wind, you need assembly facilities because it no longer becomes viable to build these on the East Coast for a market that's strictly in the western part of this country. Assembly eventually leads to manufacturing because as you have a long-term market, it makes sense then to develop that product in that marketplace. And that's where we see this going. It's a very logical, very simplistic, you could argue, view of economic development through wind energy. The point being that the western states, Montana and Livingston specifically, need no longer be isolated from the marketplace, need no longer be dependent on highways, trucks, railroad to market the product. The existing distribution grid system in this country is like a spaghetti network, and electricity will move on that. It's a very attractive proposition for diversified, decentralized, stable job economies.
You see this as an export product, then?
Yes, very much so.
And do you think there will be resistance to, in Montana to producing this for export?
Well, again, as I remarked, Montana has a rich tradition of exporting almost all of its goods. More importantly, we already have the precedent before us. I can't think of the name of the group off the top of my head, but there's already a power pool group of the Northwest, a consortium of utilities from Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, that's already power pooling and wheeling, as it's called, energy into California. So there's already existent for us, both precedent in contractual formats as well as in physical forms, the ability to generate electricity and wheel it into other markets. It's a very attractive proposition, and it's something where the country will become dependent on the West instead of the West being dependent on the country.
Kurt Nelson.
Ed, you mentioned that a lot of this research is in its infancy and American technology is really getting started. You mentioned also that Europe has done quite a bit of work in wind energy. How do you look at it internationally as an international scene? Which countries are developing wind at all, and which countries would you foresee as maybe weaseling in on our wind energy systems or selling us something we should have made ourselves? Is there anything that's happening?
The Baltic states, by and large. They've had I'm not going to get into the tulip end of wind energy. I think we're all familiar with those fancy china plates and cute plaster reliefs you hang on your wall. But in a modern sense, I think, again, remember that America tends to be a hot and cold place. There's a crisis, there's a need, all of a sudden everybody's in the marketplace. Tomorrow, all of a sudden, it's attractive to breed aardvarks. Everybody shifts their attention to that idea. Europe tends to be a more stable market, and it has had, in this case, a much longer tradition of involvement with wind energy. Remember, the Germans marched and took over the Baltic area by and large in World War II, removed most of the oil that the electrical energy was based on for those countries. And those countries turned back, especially the Baltic states, the lowlands, to a long tradition of wind energy and began developing in earnest wind turbines. They capitalized on that work from the 1940s and the late 50s and developed some very viable prototypes for wind machines that can take strong winds. On the other hand, America didn't really look twice at wind machines by and large since the time of the REAs until the energy crisis. And then all of a sudden it was a hot relationship. And I think we're still suffering from that relative instability. It has to do a great deal with the mentality of Americans in America toward the marketplace, toward making money. And until things calm down and people take a long-term look at where this whole marketplace is going, wind energy, we're going to continue to suffer from very short-term thinking on the part of Americans. It's an unfortunate situation.
Janelle Burke, we have 1 minute.
What are some of the other energy forms and how do they compare with wind? For example, wood.
Right. The National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C. has predicted that up to 20% of this country's total electric demand could be met by wind energy by the turn of the century. Whether that's attainable or not is problematical, but I think it points out one important thing. Wind energy, more than any other form of renewable electric generation, is closer to being online and ready for generation today. The other technologies are still a number of years ahead, and also we have the land base to put many of these machines east of the Rocky Mountains, primarily from Canada down to Mexico.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're out of time, and I want to, on behalf of our staff, thank you very much for being here. It's been most informative, and I express my appreciation of the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Mr. Ed Stern, discussing wind power development on both the local and the national perspective, and even internationally. We will at a later date have another program on this overall topic of resources, increasing demand and decreasing supply. Next week we'll deal with another topic. I hope you have a very good week and that you will be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to bring you another program in our series entitled Resources, Increasing Demand, Decreasing Supply. Today's program will emphasize ecological futures, and in order to carry out that goal and that topic, I'm happy to welcome to the program Dr. John Bartlett. Dr. Bartlett is the Director of Environmental Studies and also Assistant Professor for Urban and Regional Planning Department at the University of Oregon. Dr. Bartlett, prior to taking that position, was on the faculty at UCLA. He holds a baccalaureate degree in the field of biology from the College of New York at Buffalo, and he received his PhD in the field of zoology and wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Dr. Bartlett is well-published, numerous articles, and recently published a book entitled Environmental Planning and Management. He also had the honor of being program chair in 1983 of the North American Association for Environmental Education conference that was held near Detroit, Michigan. Dr. Bartlett, this whole series has been most stimulating, and I'm sure that our viewers today will find your presentation here outstanding, and we're happy to welcome you to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
I wish to welcome to the panel to question our guest today, first of all, regular panelists, Mary Lou Reed. Our second panel member today comes to us from the faculty at North Idaho College, Mr. Kurt Nelson, and our third regular panelist is Janelle Berg. We shall commence the questioning with Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Baldwin, how hopeful are you about the Earth's ecological future? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? How are we doing?
Well, I tend to go contrary to most of my colleagues, and I tend to be very optimistic about the future of this country and its natural environment. I see many signs in personal lifestyle, in the things that we consume and the way we go about our business, that we are indeed slowly changing toward a more ecological lifestyle as a population in this country. Recent surveys taken by Lou Harris, by the Council on Environmental Quality, have indicated continuing strong support on the part of American people for a quality environment and for protection from pollutants. So I remain as optimistic as ever, and my resolve to stay in the field and to contribute is as strong as ever.
Do you think this is a change in attitudes, or do you think it's been primarily a question of education?
It's hard to separate the two out. That's an excellent question. I believe that beginning in the decade of the 70s, there was really not an opportunity in most high schools and colleges to study the formal field of ecology. On the other hand, it could be argued that there was no need to do so because we didn't have serious problems up until then. So with the advent of the Lake Erie is dead, when the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire, when we had the scare with DDT and things like that, it became apparent that going about our business in the way we were was not the acceptable thing to do. So I think attitudes changed and education helped significantly.
Thank you.
Kurt Nelson.
Dr. Baldwin, a lot of effort, you say, has been recently put into environmental studies. However, the curriculum, as I review it from different universities, there's very little mention of course content dealing with strictly environmental studies. What would you recommend to young people today that might be going into chemical or environmental biological fields? What would you tell them to study or look for or seek?
I still feel very strong, excuse me, that a strong science background is necessary in the field. You need quantitative skills in chemistry, biology, techniques of ecosystem analysis, but I believe today more than ever you do need communication skills, information skills like computer courses and things such as that. And, excuse me, I'm finding that it becomes increasingly important for me personally to have graphic skills. So you need a combination of the quantitative sciences to know what it is you're talking about and why, and the scientific foundations for many of the environmental issues. And then you need to be able to effectively communicate it. And a lot of people do not have the combination of the two skills.
You mentioned some recent trends that will lead you to believe that you're very optimistic about our future ecologically. What would be maybe a couple examples of a trend that you might mention?
Well, I think probably the one I enjoy the most is decentralization and local control movement. Now, if you listen to people who are on the political right, you will hear them railing against big government. We've got to get the government off the backs of the American people. If you listen to people on the political left, they are railing against big corporations. We've got to get rid of the corporate power so we can have more control over our own lives. Both are after the same thing, it's just that they perceive a different enemy. And I think that in the coming decades, with the new technology, computers, photovoltaic arrays, Coleman heaters, solar flat plate collectors, personal gardens, The new technologies that are becoming popular, in my generation at least, are going to free up a lot of people from the constraints that they've had with utilities and industries and big government. And I think that is one sign that people are beginning to regain control of their environment, their own personal environment more.
Janelle Berg.
Sometimes we think of the environmental movement as a new thing because we hear so much more about it now than we did previously. Can you tell us something about the history of the movement?
Well, if you talk about the United States, the history of the movement would go back to probably writings of George Perkins Marsh in the late 1800s. He saw the devastation that was occurring during the robber baron era of this country, became quite concerned and wrote several volumes about man and nature. But you can go much farther back. There was an environmental movement at one time in Rome. There was an environmental movement one time in Greece. A good example of this is in Rome during the latter stages of the civilization there. There were two brothers that were storming up and down the country. They were the Gracchi brothers. They were storming up and down the countryside in Rome demanding land reform. What had happened is, through the centuries, the nobles and the merchants in the country of Rome had taken over the vast majority of the land holdings. With the peasantry having very little land. They were once quoted in the Senate as saying, "Men of Rome, you have conquered the world, but you don't own a clod of your own soil." Well, the two brothers were assassinated, to make a long story short. But you can go back, way back in time, and parallel the rise and fall of Mesopotamia, Syria, the Assyrians, the Phoenicians. You take a look at the Greek peninsula, once had 4 times the number of flowering plants that the British Isles have today. Their land was destroyed, and there were people throughout the ages who were very concerned about it. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, is another one. He noticed that when you dump sewage in wetlands, that people got malaria. So he basically, out of concern for human health, said that you shouldn't dump sewage in wetlands. And not only was he the father of medicine, but in a certain sense the father of ecology in Greece. So there is a parallel.
Dr. Baldwin, with your presentations on campus that have been most informative, you've been talking, among other things, about megatrends and what you see happening, and there's been a lot of literature written on this. Would you take a moment to talk with our viewers, those in particular that have not had the opportunity yet to read some of those writings, what you're talking about toward the future when you see some significant changes happening to our society that evolve around the ecological future as you see it?
Well, I think as it's hard to make real generalizations, but I guess we're forced to do so. In the last several years, the movement of the rural population to the urban areas of this country has reversed. And that's a significant reversal. In essence, we're getting back to the basics. People want a more rural lifestyle, less consumptive, less material things. I think I give an entire lecture at the University of Oregon about the possession of stuff and how many people spend most of their lives accumulating stuff as they're raising families and developing houses and things like that. The children leave, and then you spend the rest of your life getting rid of your stuff. And I liken it to Henry David Thoreau, who said, "It's life near the bone where it's sweetest. Superfluous wealth can buy superfluities only." And I really do believe that, and I think a lot of Americans are rejecting the old high power, high consumption, high fashion lifestyle in favor of family, in favor of amenities, quality of life, and things such as that. I see that as a real movement in this country.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest today is Dr. John Bartlett, who's helping us with our series, Resources, Increasing Demand and Decreasing Supply. He is the Director of Environmental Studies and Assistant Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Oregon. We will continue the questioning with Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Baldwin, I that your stuff on stuff. I think that really is a good statement. I'd like to ask you if you feel that there are any changes in public policy that should be made in order to continue this trend towards improving the environment. We have the National Environmental Protection Act, we have EPA. What other things would you like to see take place that would ensure that this trend is a positive one?
I would very definitely excuse me, like to see the depoliticization of these agencies. The notion that conservation is the domain of liberals, I think, is a vastly overstated notion. The word conservation came from conservative. I'm a very conservative person in many ways. And I do not believe it is a policy of a conservative to give away the resources of this country to whoever it's given away to. It should be allocated out, and the public should get a return on the minerals and resources that exist on public lands. So when the current administration cuts budgets, disrupts programs, does not implement certain policies, I do not believe they're reflecting a true conservative viewpoint. And so I would like to see the Environmental Protection Agency become something like the Federal Reserve, where you have a professional staff of scientists, engineers, economists, public policy people, that they are there no matter what administration is there, and that their job is to clean up toxic waste and air pollution and water pollution in the most efficient manner possible. And I say that should not be a political issue.
Has anything like this been suggested?
Yes.
And how far has it gone?
It has just been initiated, actually, in reaction to some of the policies of this administration. So it's too early yet to see how far this will go.
But you could see that something like the Superfund almost needs to have this kind of objectivity in order for it to actually do what it's supposed to do.
And it's also necessary to maintain a staff of professional scientists and economists and engineers, because if I were a young person graduating from college with a PhD looking toward a career in the EPA, would I now be thinking of a 40-year career having seen the tremendous cuts that have recently occurred? I'd frankly have to have my head examined. With the political movement back and forth and hirings and firings, you cannot get good technical people to commit themselves for a lifetime to something that they might be fired.
And perhaps if they have committed themselves, their morale at this point might be very low.
Morale is very low. The Washington Post ran an editorial about the EPA excuse me, about a year ago, saying the title of it is, I believe it's Gloom and Doom at the EPA, talking about the brightest people who could jump have jumped, leaving behind people who couldn't find other employment. In other words, people who were less well suited for private and public sector work elsewhere. So they called it the brain drain. And I really do feel this has occurred to a certain extent.
Kurt Nelson.
You mentioned this morning a little about industrialization, or how we're going away from industrialization and going towards a society which is going to be involved with information. Now, what does it really mean, the term to you, information society or information theory, etc.?
It means the development, analysis, processing, communication, integration of information. It means clerks, lawyers, architects, designers, professional teachers, service industries, and things such as this, as opposed to the steel mill. Now, I was born and raised in a rural area of Appalachia in Pennsylvania, and heavy industry dominated that particular area. Well, the heavy industry, as you know, in the last 3 years have had a great deal of difficulty maintaining themselves with their labor contracts, the rising cost of raw materials, and a shortage of demand because people haven't had money to purchase the goods. So I do believe we are slowly but surely making a necessary transition from an energy and materials intensive society to an information one. Moving from, in essence, what the ecologist would call a pioneer community, where we come in and we take the resources, exploit and develop, to a more thoughtful, efficient, mature, what is called a climax community in the ecological sciences.
Janelle Berg.
One of the issues that has been very important to us, and about which a great deal has been written, is wilderness. Can you tell us about the wilderness issue?
It's something I've been concerned about for a long time. Perhaps I can back up a little bit and say I was born and raised in Appalachia. The town I was raised in at one time had the largest pulp mill and the largest tannery, I believe, on earth. They had 32,000 people in the community, and it was a real boom cycle in the early 1900s. Today, there are 600 people in that town. I then went to graduate school in Wisconsin. At one time, Wisconsin was the #1 timber producing state in the country, believe it or not. This was in the 1930s. There was a real boom and then a real bust. And I believe we're seeing a similar thing in the Pacific Northwest. Yet, for the first time, we have the opportunity to set aside some of that old growth forests, some of our most beautiful public lands, and actually, by definition, many of these lands, because they are so steep, so high, so remote, are exactly the same lands that are the most difficult to timber. So for the first time, we have the opportunity to set some aside. And I say we are not setting even enough aside. That if you live on the East Coast, you will appreciate the fact that during the peak season of the summer, take a hike in the Adirondack State Park in New York State, and it's sort of like a cattle crossing. There are so many people up there. And I believe that with the demand for wilderness experiences increasing, the last figure I saw was about 14% a year, having substantial wilderness in the long term will be very good for economic development because people will want to come.
What are the costs of wilderness?
The costs of wilderness, you will end up losing some short-term timber production. You will end up having some costs of administration with the Park Service or some similar agency. You will have figures crop up 3 to 5% shortfall but in timber production. But I believe it was Senator Clinton B. Anderson a number of years ago who said, are we really a wealthy nation if we have to go after every last drop of water, barrel of oil, or stick of timber? Are we really a rich nation if we can't set some of this aside for our children?
And what do you see as the advantages of wilderness?
Many. One advantage is ecological diversity. We have found time and time again in the biological sciences that native genetic pools have been extremely useful for agriculture, for basic engineering research, biological research. It is important to maintain diversity. You have recreation. I really love putting a backpack on the one day of the year I get off and going up to a wilderness area and knowing it's there. I would say a third thing, and this is perhaps less convincing to the audience, and that is the right for some of these things to exist by themselves. Whether you believe in the evolutionary theory of life or you believe in creationism, basically the argument goes that if God created nature, do we have a right to destroy it? It says, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. That's something that is not really emphasized in Genesis. It does not say destroy. On the other hand, if you follow evolutionary theory, these plants and animals have evolved for 4 billion years. Don't they have, just by that fact, a right to life? So there are some strong arguments, and there are moral and religious arguments that can be made there.
Dr. Baldwin, you gave a test to our audience this morning, and it was a rather large audience, and I found it impressive that you give that large audience a test. And I know we don't have time on this program to go in detail, but you do have a personal energy audit that individuals can take to see how much energy they consume in their home and in their lives. Would you just take a moment to talk about the points, and maybe later some other organizations could get from you this if they wish to follow this?
Mm-hmm. What this involves is asking the individual to calculate out their personal energy consumption, not just in their homes, but from transportation, from cooking, from lighting, from the various major appliances that they own and consume, and also from the miscellaneous appliances or stuff that I talked about earlier. When we talk about energy conservation, you will hear the utilities recommend that we weatherize our homes, and that's it. But there are an awful lot of behavioral things that we can do if we just know how much energy we're consuming in other aspects of our lives. So, for instance, in this energy audit, I pointed out that to take this trip from Eugene, Oregon to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, would have required 30 times more energy by flying than by taking the train. Personal energy consumption. Now, it's slightly more expensive to fly, maybe twice as expensive, but there's 30 times more energy involved in that. And if consumers are aware of that and that they do favor energy conservation, they might adjust their behavior accordingly. I did. I took a train to Berkeley last weekend.
One more point on this, just to give the individuals an idea that in the Northwest we have a quite outstanding score compared to the United States. Would you show what the score is in the country, in the Northwest, and then how that compares with world?
Well, I surveyed a group of students and faculty here at North Idaho College, and I would say from a hand survey, that the average is approximately 50 points in my survey. The national average, on the other hand, is 100 points. So the people here are consuming at half the national average. I've done a similar survey in Eugene, and we are about equivalent with you, and thus I drew the Ecotopia analogy. I've done the same survey at UCLA, where students do not live near campus, and students and faculty have to commute in 6-lane freeways at 70 miles an hour, and found that they consumed 1.5 times the national average. Yet, at the very end, I pointed out that despite the fact that we are doing well in the Pacific Northwest, that 50-point score that the local people received is 5 times the world average. The world average energy consumption is about 10 points on this survey. And at 50 points, Eugene and people here in Coeur d'Alene are 5 times that.
Lou Reed.
Well, what should we do about it? How are we going to change our national and our regional habits?
I think we are. I very seldom see large gas-guzzling automobiles on the roads. You can now buy vans that get 30 miles to the gallon, and even camping trailers that get 28 miles to the gallon. We're putting our engineers and scientists back to work redesigning our technology. Our homes are more energy efficient. We have better, more energy efficient appliances available to us. And last but not least, I think the infatuation with new modern appliances, save perhaps video games or something like that, is waning. People are learning that a can opener where you turn a hand like this will last you 70 years, and the hand is very reliable. Whereby if you have a can opener that relies on electricity, you have to get rid of it about once every 12 years. You're consuming electricity. It's inconvenient. I think basically what we're doing is getting back some common sense.
Very good.
I wish we could go on with this interview, but as always, the clock wins out. And Dr. Baldwin, on behalf of our staff, I want to thank you for coming. You have been very generous with your time on the campus and on this program, and I'm sure our viewers have enjoyed it. And I would like to welcome you back at another time, and so we could continue this again.
I'll bring my fishing pole, and thank you very much.
I would also express my appreciation to the panel for their outstanding questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. John Baldwin, who is Director of Environmental Studies and Assistant Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Oregon. As I indicated at the beginning of the program, he has been with us, as other guests have been, dealing with resources, increasing demand, and decreasing supply. Once again, I wish to thank the Convocations Committee for allowing us to use their guests while they're here on this program. We have a couple more of these programs that at a later date we will bring to you, and we hope you will be with us that time. Next week we'll deal with a different subject. I hope you have a very good week, and please be with us again. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time. Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to bring you another program in our series entitled Resources, Increasing Demand, Decreasing Supply. This particular program will be on the subject of an assessment of space resources. In order to accomplish our task of presenting that particular subtopic, I am very happy to welcome to the program Dr. John Lewis. Dr. Lewis is a professor of planetary sciences at the University of Arizona, where he has been since 1982. Prior to that time, he was also in the field of academic pursuits as professor of planetary sciences at MIT. Our guest today holds a baccalaureate degree in chemistry from Princeton University, a master's degree in organic chemistry from Dartmouth College, and a PhD in geochemistry and physical chemistry from the University of California at San Diego. In addition to these impressive credentials, our guest today has been well published, including a number of different articles. In addition to that, he served on various committees and commissions. For example, he was a member of the NASA headquarters Planetary Atmosphere Management Operations Working Group from 1979 to 1980. Dr. Lewis, you, like our other guests this week, come to us with very outstanding credentials, and certainly you would be qualified to discuss this very important topic, and we would like to welcome you to our campus.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm happy to welcome to the panel to question our guests today. First of all, regular panelist Mary Lou Reed, our second panelist from the faculty at North Idaho College, Dr. Ken Wright, who's appeared on this program as a panel member many times before, and we're happy to have him back, and also regular panelist Janelle Berg. We shall pursue the questioning with Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Lewis, you see space as a possible new frontier for the mining of strategic minerals, as I understand it. Could you tell our audience a little bit more about your ideas? What parts of space, and how big are the asteroids that you're talking about? Would you go into your into your thinking along this line?
Surely, it's hard to make it short. In fact, that's such an open question. Essentially, the most severe factor in determining where you can get materials in space is how much energy it takes to get from that source back to Earth. And that limiting factor means that virtually the entire solar system is ruled out, and our attention is then focused on just a relative handful of bodies. The ones that are energetically close enough to Earth to be interesting are the Moon, the near-Earth asteroids. These are not members of the asteroid belt. They're objects that orbit much closer to the Sun than the asteroid belt itself. And curiously enough, the two satellites of Mars, they're also energetically quite close to Earth.
Yes. Could you talk a little bit more about what you call these Earth-approaching asteroids? Because I don't think that many of us know very much about them.
Well, there's a good reason for it. That is that there are only a handful known, and most of them have been discovered very recently. In fact, of the 6 of them that get closest to Earth, 5 of the 6 have been discovered since 1980. These asteroids they're typically the size of a mountain. They're 1 kilometer to a few kilometers in diameter. The biggest ones are probably about 50 kilometers, which is a pretty impressive mountain. They are very variable in their composition. They appear, as a rule, to be very distinct individuals. They all certainly don't fall into a single category insofar as their composition is concerned. Some of these asteroids are so close to the Earth, their orbits are so similar to the Earth's orbit, that they can in fact pass between the Earth and the Moon from time to time. And eventually, in the long run, over tens of millions of years, these objects are mostly fated to collide with the Earth or with Venus.
Thank you.
Dr. Wright.
Yes, Dr. Lewis. In a talk earlier today at North Idaho College, you talked about the economics of returning minerals from outer space, and I've been under the impression until listening to you today that this was kind of a Buck Rogers type of a scheme. It was really far out and pretty much pie in the sky. Would you care to tell us what's happened that's changed the picture?
Well, first of all, the discovery of these Earth-approaching asteroids has made a huge difference. Previously, it was assumed that the interesting types of meteorites that fell on Earth mostly came from the asteroid belt in one step. That means that if we were to find a class of meteorites falling on Earth that had economic interest, that in order to exploit that material, we would have to travel out to the asteroid belt, find a parent body very far removed from Earth, extract the material from that asteroid, and then bring it back from the asteroid belt to Earth. This is energetically prohibitive. The costs of doing it are just outrageous. And it certainly was pie in the sky to dream of exploiting such resources until these near-Earth asteroids were discovered within the last couple of years. To return from a typical location in the asteroid belt to the vicinity of the Earth requires a velocity change of several kilometers per second. There is one Earth-approaching asteroid known from which the necessary velocity to return to Earth is 0.057 kilometers per second, and the energy required is proportional to the square of that velocity change. So we're talking here about an object which is 10,000 times energetically more accessible than a typical belt asteroid. That's a very big change.
Do these asteroids have minerals on them that are valuable to us, and how do we know what their composition is?
Yes, they do. First of all, we know enormous detail about many asteroids from the study of meteorites. The meteorites mostly or all originate from particular asteroids. So we have in our hands meteorite samples. In fact, 3,000 meteorites have been studied in the laboratory. So we do indeed see very interesting and economically attractive minerals in those meteorites. There's a terrible problem, however, in getting from a meteorite sample in your hand to a particular asteroid. We don't know in advance, when we pick up a meteorite on the ground, where it came from. So if we find an interesting material in that meteorite, we don't know which asteroid to visit in order to collect tank car quantities of the same material. And that's a very challenging proposition, and one that's required some recent advances in astronomical techniques in order to make that connection between the particular meteorites and particular asteroids.
Janelle Berg.
Speaking a little more generally about resources in space, what are the resources that could be gleaned from space?
There are, I would suppose, at least 3 major categories. One of these categories is materials that are intrinsically so valuable that it is worthwhile to bring them back to Earth. This means materials with values of at least many dollars on up to $10,000 a pound. These are the platinum group metals, and they are found in native metal in meteorites. That's category number one, things clearly worth bringing back to Earth. Second category would be strategic metals that are extremely useful on Earth, but whose intrinsic cost per pound is not nearly that high. And I would refer here to titanium and vanadium, chromium, manganese, cobalt, and the like. Their prices range from $1 a pound on up to perhaps $25 a pound, $20 a pound. Those elements are found not as metals in meteorites, but as compounds, and they're not by any means equally accessible in different classes of meteorites. In fact, there are only one or two classes of meteorites from which these might be easily extracted. The third category would be materials such as water, carbon dioxide, organic material, nitrogen, phosphorus, which would be useful as either life support materials or nutrients for a space colony, or as propellants. Water makes an excellent propellant. When you electrolyze it into hydrogen and oxygen, you then have a very high energy propellant system that's of great value. And if you don't have to pay the cost of lifting those propellants from Earth into low Earth orbit, but can in fact get them in space, acquire them from asteroids, then you're saving a tremendous amount of money, because you don't have to pay for the launch costs for these materials. It may be much less expensive to bring them down to low Earth orbit from an asteroid than to bring them up to low Earth orbit from with the shuttle.
Dr. Lewis, concerning what you've been describing, that those minerals or resources are there, at this moment, do we have the technical ability, knowledge, and equipment to actually bring those resources to the Earth if we were to choose to do so? Or is there more research needed in that area before we can technically do it?
In almost every respect, we know that it is feasible to do it. In some areas, we are not sure what it would cost to do it, and in some areas, we are quite convinced that a development effort would improve our ability to carry out these things. Speaking in such general terms is probably not profitable. Let me just say that one example would be in high efficiency propulsion systems, such as nuclear electric power or solar electric power, solar electric propulsion. These systems have been studied at great length. They have not actually been used for spacecraft missions into deep space, and for that reason there is some uncertainty as to exactly what is the best way to carry out a particular mission with that kind of propulsion system. Studies to optimize that kind of a system so as to make it as efficient as possible can easily be planned and executed and don't require an exorbitant amount of money, and they can be done in a short period of time. So studies of that sort are in fact now being undertaken.
As an expert in this field, would you also indicate to our audience if you feel, in your opinion, that there are adequate supplies to make this worthwhile? In other words, particularly if we get in trouble with the resource we have on this planet, do you feel that there's a rather large volume of materials that could be brought back?
Yeah, the experts who are knowledgeable about this, who have studied the impacts of the Earth-approaching asteroids on the terrestrial planets and therefore have some idea of how many of them there are, say that there are 1,000 to 2,000 Earth-approaching asteroids. Each one of these asteroids contains a supply of the platinum group metals which is sufficient to last our civilization for as long as you care to think about it.
Thank you. Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Lewis, would you share your vision of just how you would imagine one of these mining expeditions to follow through? I mean, how many people would go, in what kind of a vehicle, what kind of a community would they set up? I'm sure you've thought through some of the practicalities. How long does it take to get there?
Yes, a considerable amount of mission planning has been done, beginning with scientific missions to send a small automated spacecraft out to look at an asteroid and find out what it's made of, what the strength of its surface materials are, and so on. So there's a lot of information to draw on. First of all, if you decide you want to send people to an asteroid, the price tag immediately escalates out of sight and you can't make a profit no matter what you bring back.
So you wouldn't be sending people?
You would definitely not be sending people to an asteroid.
So that takes care of a lot of problems like oxygen and...
You have to design any kind of an exploitation venture to be as simple as possible. Simple means that you can automate it and that you don't need to have the enormous expense of carrying along people and their life support equipment. I think a simple scenario would be as follows. The equipment necessary to mine or extract metal grains from an asteroid would be launched into low Earth orbit by the shuttle. There would be a small mining vehicle, there would be a propulsion system to take it out to an asteroid, and then there would be several return devices, essentially a heat shield and a small guidance system and a small propulsion system, a stack of them. This entire stack would be placed in Earth orbit, low Earth orbit by the shuttle. The propulsion system would be used to lift that entire stack out of the Earth's gravity field and to land it on an asteroid. Once on the asteroid, the mining vehicle would extract metal grains from the surface by, if necessary, crushing the rocks. If it's already crushed, then simply picking up the iron grains with a magnet.
You do as much refining as possible there.
You do as little as possible there, but in fact it may be simpler to just pick up dirt. But you want to keep it as simple as possible. Just pick up the dirt and load it aboard the return vehicles. The return vehicles then, one at a time, as soon as they're full, are set aside out of harm's way while the mining operation continues, and the asteroid continues on around the sun. After about a year, or perhaps 2 years, of this kind of operation, the asteroid is then back in a position so that a launch from it to the Earth will require very little energy. At that time, the fully loaded return vehicles take off one at a time from the asteroid using very little propellant, incidentally. Something close to 1% of the mass of returned material is required as propellant. So in order to bring back 100 tons, you may need a half a ton or 1 ton of propellant to bring it back. So that's not a very serious problem. These vehicles then return from the asteroid. They're launched into return trajectories to Earth. Their return to Earth will be staggered over a period of months. Each one of them, when it encounters the upper atmosphere of the Earth, will skim through the upper atmosphere and dissipate some of its energy so that it's now gravitationally bound to Earth. It will then come back, make another pass through the upper atmosphere and be decelerated again and be in a smaller orbit and continue for several passes through the atmosphere until the return vehicle is in a nearly circular orbit around the Earth. It then fires a small rocket engine briefly to accelerate it slightly when it's at apogee, highest point in its orbit, to circularize the orbit. And that orbit can be made to match with the orbit of a space shuttle. Processing can be done by astronauts aboard the space shuttle. By the time that this is done, there will probably be a small American space station in orbit around the Earth, which can serve as a basis for processing activities, for fabrication of objects to be used in space, and for the extraction of precious materials to be returned to Earth. This could be done in perhaps 10 years. 10 years.
This would all be managed, though, by people in the space shuttle or someplace on Earth, so there would be a management, a rather intricate management problem, I would imagine.
There will be activities going on simultaneously on several different asteroids. There will be a number of these automatic return vehicles between the asteroids and the Earth. There will be a command center on the ground. There will be a space station in orbit, and there will be space shuttles ferrying back and forth between the space station and the ground.
And ways to make sure that the splashdown is not in the Pacific Ocean. Excuse me.
Yes, but that's not a problem. You would not create any damage on the ground if one of these 100 or 1,000 ton return vehicles were to enter the atmosphere inadvertently, because the cargo is dust. It's metal particles that are smaller than grains of sand. So if your guidance system should die as the vehicle approaches Earth, and it should come heading in, aimed for Denver, the vehicle would simply disrupt in a cloud of dust at very high altitudes. Nothing would reach the ground except perhaps little scraps of aluminum foil. That's what survives when rocket boosters re-enter the atmosphere, not the big heavy pieces, but the light fluffy pieces.
Just a dust storm.
Dr. Wright.
Dr. Lewis, I think we're going to come back to this topic of recovering metals and materials from space, but I'd like to shift gears just a little while and talk about extraterrestrial life. You've been involved with some NASA committees that have looked into this. Could you summarize for us as briefly as is possible the present status with respect to our search for extraterrestrial life, and if you would, give us your opinion about what you think the United States should be doing and how much we should be spending to pursue this?
Well, there's a discipline which is the study of extraterrestrial life. It's called exobiology, and it is commonly referred to as the largest scientific discipline that has no object of study, since we've never seen any extraterrestrial life and have no direct evidence of any. So the real issue, the real question that's of interest is not what is life on planet so-and-so like, since we know nothing about that. That'd be rank speculation. The real interesting issue, and the one that we can say something about, is how does life come into existence and how does it develop on the Earth in the early history of the Earth, and how does it, what are the likelihoods that such processes operating on other planets will similarly result in the appearance of life on them. And that can be taken apart into several different questions. One of them is, how is organic matter made in the first place? Where is it located in the solar system or in the cosmos? How complex is this organic matter? In what kinds of environments can that organic matter complexify, to borrow a phrase from Théod de Chardin, and become something interesting, self-replicating, like a virus? And in what range of environments can complex organisms possibly survive and propagate and continue this complexification process to make something capable of talking back to you? And some progress has been made, especially in the first couple of those areas. Organic matter has been found to be abundant in interstellar clouds in the galaxy. Wherever there are star-forming regions where stars and planetary systems are now being formed in the galaxy, where we see new stars appearing, where we see gas and dust clouds collapsing, we also see organic matter. Approximately 36 different organic compounds have been found in these interstellar clouds. And as we progress trying to find more, the biggest limiting factor turns out to be the lack of adequate laboratory data on some of the likely compounds. There may be many more out there, but we lack the laboratory data on how these molecules absorb microwave radiation to be able to identify more molecules. It's a curious situation that the problem is not in our stars, but in ourselves. There's organic matter in profusion in the atmosphere of Titan. It's produced by ultraviolet radiation from the sun and by magnetospheric particles from Saturn hitting the atmosphere of Titan. Titan is the largest satellite of Saturn. The Voyager spacecraft took a good look at Titan. A variety of organic molecules were detected in its atmosphere by infrared spectroscopy. There they are. And there are quite reasonable explanations of how they are formed, based on our understanding of what sources of energy are going into the atmosphere of Titan and how the chemistry behaves at those low temperatures, only about 100 degrees absolute, which means about 300 below zero Fahrenheit. That is not very Earth-like. But on Mars, the most Earth-like of the planets, there's no evidence for any life, nor any evidence for organic matter. And there is strong and, in fact, overwhelming evidence for processes on Mars that produce oxidizing agents that are so strong that they'd burn up any organic molecules that were present. You could supply life to Mars, and it would not be able to maintain itself under present conditions, because killing ultraviolet light reaches the ground, produces atomic oxygen and ozone right down there in the dirt. So any organism on Mars which was up high enough in the dirt to see the sun and to gain energy from sunlight would also be breathing ozone and breathing atomic oxygen. And these are two species that are used in the laboratory to destroy organic matter completely, quantitatively.
Where does our program stand right now? How much is the United States doing to pursue this investigation?
The United States spent $1 billion on the Viking program to Mars to go and look for life. The Viking program is a very interesting one and an exceedingly competently built spacecraft, but it was but one of a lengthy list of different spacecraft missions that were proposed by the scientific community, and Viking was not at the top of the list as far as the scientific community was concerned. The reason is simple. It was a one-purpose mission. It was designed to look for life on Mars, and in the opinion of many scientists, it was likely to fail. Either because there wasn't any life, or because Martian life, if present, diverge sufficiently from terrestrial life so that our naive little experiments for detecting life on Mars wouldn't work. The Martian bugs wouldn't realize that what we were offering them was food or whatever. So that was a big program in the 1970s, and it used up the entire reserve of congressional interest in the search for life, I'm afraid. So it's extremely difficult now to get any funding from Congress to look for life anywhere, because they have the feeling that they were had. And they were had, curiously enough, by Congress, because it was Congress that found the search for little green men on Mars to be so overwhelmingly exciting that the Viking mission was funded above many other scientific missions that had a higher priority among scientists.
Janelle Berg.
What you have to say is very interesting. What are the planetary sciences? You are a professor of planetary sciences. What are the planetary sciences? What are the courses that students take when they're in your department? Why should they take these courses? What future is there for them in your field? Mm-hmm. What are some of the other disciplines that you interrelate with?
That's good for several hours of answers right there. The planetary sciences, if I can oversimplify, are geology, astronomy, chemistry, and physics. Many people have hoped for a long time that biology would become a planetary science, and in a sense it has, in that biology, the effects of life on Earth are now looked at in a planetary sense, on a planetary scale. This is something that has come out of the ability to look at life on a planetary scale from Earth-orbiting spacecraft. So with deference to some of my colleagues who might not feel quite so good about it, I would tend to include biology now as a planetary science, in that it is in fact asking questions and answering questions that are relevant to the evolution of whole planets, in this case Earth. The planetary science curriculum is, of course, a fairly specialized and sophisticated one in a sense. That is, whenever you study about planets, you're studying something very specific and narrow. However, the practitioners of planetary science come from every discipline you've ever heard of in the sciences, except perhaps psychology. They're very widely distributed over the spectrum of the physical sciences. There are many biochemists and organic chemists who've taken an interest in the program and participate in it, doing laboratory experiments and analyzing the surface of Mars. If a student, a high school student, is interested in finding out about planetary sciences and interested in becoming one, perhaps, or making sure that their training is adequate so that they might someday become a planetary scientist, what should they do? Well, the answer is, as an undergraduate, major in a hard science, even mathematics. You'd be amazed at the ways in which all of the basic sciences are used by the practitioners of planetary science.
What is the future for a planetary scientist? Why do we need such persons?
Well, first of all, we want to find out how planets work because we live on one. Mm-hmm. And if we didn't know, if we maintained our ignorance of how Earth operates for a long enough time, it would kill us in the end. The price of ignorance in a complicated world is death, to be very frank about it. Now, that's a strong statement, and it sounds like a political statement more than a scientific statement. But let me give you an example. One of several I can give you. Back in the late 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union began launching spacecraft to the planets. The Soviet Union actually began in 1962, but did not enjoy great success for several years. One of the first planets we looked at in some detail was Venus. The atmosphere of Venus was found by Earth-based spectroscopy to have hydrochloric acid and hydrofluoric acid, carbon monoxide, and all kinds of other noxious and foul-tasting substances in its atmosphere. And a graduate student at MIT, who happened to be one of my students, became interested in the presence of hydrochloric acid. He had the feeling that it ought to be decomposed by sunlight very rapidly, and he wondered whether there might not be some chemical mechanism in the atmosphere of Venus that reconstituted it and put it back together so that there'd be enough there so that we could still observe it, even though it was being destroyed rapidly. So he looked at the chemistry of chlorine in the atmosphere of Venus fairly closely, and he discovered a whole network of reactions which transfer oxygen atoms around. Now, at the same time he was doing this, NASA was also funding a study on the effects of the solid propellant boosters, large solid propellant boosters on the Earth's atmosphere, because there is an organic glue-like compound called a binder in these propellants that contains chlorine. So NASA funded a study of chlorine in the Earth's atmosphere.
I'm so sorry to interrupt that point, but we're out of time. We must stop. On behalf of our panel and our staff, I want to thank you. You've been very, very informative, and I've enjoyed the program, and I know our viewers have enjoyed it as well. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. John Lewis, who is a professor of planetary sciences at the University of Arizona, and prior to that, he also was a professor in the same field at MIT. He's been with us in our series on resources, and he's been discussing today an assessment of space resources. I hope you'll be with us again next week at this very same time. Please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.